Every day we're surrounded by superficial perfection. Not only advertising, but the mainstreams of TV, film, and music are soaked in professional expertise and polished to a perfectly smooth shine. Lighting, color grading, hyper-professionalized performances, pitch correction and quantization, insidiously invisible digital enhancements, and outright digital fabrications. All meticulously calculated to sand off all the edges and to render artistry and expression down to a maximally homogeneous product. Not that there's anything wrong with the pursuit of perfection. An enormous amount of work and skill and even individual pride goes into even the blandest of media products, and I'm often impressed and occasionally even inspired by randomly elegant choices made by some anonymous photographer, cinematographer, commercial actor, or session musician as their work for hire flickers into my awareness from some screen or other. But I've got to admit that I mostly find all this aesthetic tidiness incredibly boring, and I find myself constantly chafing against its boundaries. But instead of complaining about it, I'll instead celebrate its obverse by highlighting a handful of records that I love. These records captured lightning in a cracked bottle, and their rough and ramshackle nature is the very thing that makes them so special. The pursuit of perfection has its place, but sometimes you just have to make a mess. Over the course of 1983, Swiss heavy metal group Hellhammer recorded a series of demos that are so amateurish as to be embarrassing. The sound is bad. The best sounding cuts are pleasingly lo-fi, but the worst sounding ones are completely overwhelmed by clearly audible problems with the tape recorder. The music is simple, not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of metal bands were getting pretty fancy by 83, so it certainly was not generally regarded as a point in their favor. And the playing is so messy that most musicians would probably be embarrassed to hear it played back as a rehearsal tape, let alone as a demo that the band actually released. They were widely mocked in the underground press of the day, with many publications jumping at the chance to call them not only some of the worst heavy metal releases of the year, but some of the worst heavy metal records ever. The reception of these things was so bad that it not only broke up the band the following year, but it very nearly sunk Celtic Frost, the successor band formed by some of the same musicians, before it even started. These things were considered so bad that they almost sunk two bands, one of which didn't even exist yet. Of course, we now know that they are among the finest heavy metal records of all time. Let's talk for a minute about what actually makes music good. As a general rule, heavy metal bands are usually trying to play as precisely as possible. There are good and bad reasons for this. The good reason is that heavy metal, like rock and roll in general, is a very rhythmic music, which means that if you drift too far from a steady tempo or a strict phase locking, the thing risks falling apart entirely. But some of it is also just a cultural bias within metal. It is a crass stereotype that heavy metal musicians are often more impressed by technical mastery than by feel, but that stereotype is often true. But just because metal bands are usually trying to play precisely doesn't necessarily mean they're any worse off when they miss the mark. Great musicians play with the beat on an incredibly sophisticated and subtle micro-rhythmic level. This subtlety makes their music come alive in ways that are hard to pinpoint and sometimes very nearly defy all understanding. Unskilled musicians simply cannot achieve this kind of subtlety and sophistication. On purpose. But extremely unskilled musicians with good instincts can sometimes stumble into it on accident. A couple years back, I wrote a zine about the first wave of black metal, and because I'm not one to let a good paragraph go to waste, here's what I had to say about Death Fiend. Though it drew much low-hanging fruit criticism in the metal fan press of its day, it turns out that the sloshing asynchronicity of Hellhammer's early years is the real secret of these 83 demos. It's not just that the tempo wanders up and down as they play, which it does, it's that the three guys are always speeding up and slowing down even in relation to each other, creating a loosely wound and continually unraveling time feel that's got more to do with feel than time, with Day driving the stumbling host forward while the warriors clang out unison riffs that are no such thing. But it never actually does unravel because they've got great ears, which is another way of saying that they're actually listening to each other. Any given one of them is always letting the other two push or pull him back into something approximating sync, even as their collective inexperience makes them wander right back out. The result is pure fucking magic, with their frankly rudimentary compositions belying a deeply compelling, if unintentional, subtlety that you can feel from the very first instant, even if you don't know why. In other words, rock and roll. But my favorite example of the great Hellhammer slosh comes from Crucifixion off Triumph of Death. When the main part of the tune starts around 45 seconds in after a pretty elaborate two-part intro, drummer Bruce Day comes in completely wrong. The tempo is so fast that it's hard to pinpoint the issue, but if you listen closely, you can hear that he clearly comes down with his snare on the 1 when it's supposed to be on the backbeat. Now, there's a couple things worth noting here. The first is that this is the first track of the demo, which, because demo tapes are usually recorded in the order in which they are presented to save editing time, means the band probably just wasn't warmed up yet. The other is that the second part of that elaborate intro is just the whole band going completely crazy and making a bunch of noise in no particular time at all. By the way, the first part of the intro is a spliced-in recording of Bach's Toccata in D minor. Metal bands love that shit. So Day is understandably not in a super locked-in headspace at the top of the form, but regardless, he waits for his cue and comes in loud, hard, and raw. What follows is about 10 seconds of clearly audible panic as he does manage to squish his snare drum back onto the backbeat where it belongs. It's honestly kind of an impressive fix at speed, even if it is only the result of a colossal fuck-up initially. But a blatant fuck-up it is nonetheless, and it is on the record, and I love it. The Meat Puppets have been around since 1980, and they have been great the whole time. In the 80s, they were among the first underground masters of indie rock. In the 90s, they had an incredible second wind with Too High to Die in 1994, which is one of the greatest grunge records of all time. And in the 21st century, they have maintained their status as venerable punk rock godfathers. I saw them at a bowling alley in 2019, and they completely destroyed. But in their early years, they were a hilarious mess. They debuted with their EP In a Car in 1991. It is a screaming noise rock avant-hardcore cowpunk nightmare, and I love it. Their first full-length, just titled Meat Puppets, is pretty much more of the same. They do claim that it was recorded in a single 3-day session while they were high on acid the entire time. I do not know if that is true, but it does seem plausible. Those are two ridiculously chaotic records, which are honestly pretty great in their own right, but it's Meat Puppets 2 that's their real masterpiece. Meat Puppets 2 is a little bit less messy because basically everything is at least a little bit less messy than Meat Puppets 1, but it's still not exactly a gem of technical perfection. It's a loose record with very shaky synchronization between the different musicians and vocals that are only loosely concerned with pitch, and it is one of the greatest records of all time. I also wrote a zine about 80s noise rock last year. Here's what I had to say about Split Myself in Two and New Gods, in which the Pups work the inscrutable cosmic tangle of their first record into human-readable rock and roll songs, and it turns out to be a couple of great ones. Panicked micro-fables about fate, debt, fear, logistics, and what you're gonna do about it all. Is that razor in your shoe really gonna cut you free of the devil when he comes around to collect? Well, better keep it there anyway, just in case. And about Lost and climbing. Meat Puppets 2 is one of the greatest records ever because it sits at the nexus of the cosmically boundless and the arts and crafts minuscule, and the band's unraveled musicianship is the point where the two planes intersect. Their airy country arrangements are homely in their missynced amateurishness, but those same micro-scale gaps and stumbles give the tunes an endless interior vastness even, and especially, at their most tossed off. Tempo's less than steady, snare hits rushed as often as not, Kurt's singing often out of tune and usually out of time as his guitar veers wildly between sloppy and virtuosic. Every little detail of the record, accidental or otherwise, thrums with the very same magical and mundane mysteries that the lyrics ponder. They don't assign equal weight to the inevitability of loss as to the clutter on the table, but they know that both need to be addressed. Plateau is a little less messy, but still very laid back, and while There's Nothing at the Top But a Bucket and a Mop and an illustrated book about birds may very well be the most profound thing ever said about transcendence, somehow I don't think it would read quite as well if there was a professional-sounding singer singing it. Likewise for We're Here, which would not sound nearly so serene if it weren't also so mumbly. And Oh Me and Lake of Fire are two melodramatic tunes with very belty melodies that Kurt Kirkwood does not actually have the chops to belt. I could imagine someone like Robert Plant making a meal of them, and honestly, it wouldn't be as good. And Whistling Song appropriately literally whistles us out of the record. Even the instrumentals are really good. It might seem strange to have so many instrumentals on such a lyrics-driven record, but I do think that the loosely stitched together nature of the structure works to its advantage. It kind of feels like they're playing show and tell with them. I do literally think that Meat Puppets 2 is one of the great works of art of the entire 20th century, but it feels less like a great work of art and more like the greatest arts and crafts project of all time. Back in 1982, San Francisco-based Flipper are working on their own masterpiece. The cheekily titled Album Generic Flipper is one of the greatest records of all time, and everything about it is a huge mess. The tempos swim around, the drums are shaky, the bass honks like a clumsy fucked up tuba, and the vocals are yelled, chanted, or talked, but never quite sang. But it's guitarist Ted Falcone who's the most chaotic of them all. His playing here just might be the most unhinged performance I have ever heard on a rock record. And I wrote 31,000 words about 80s noise rock. When I'm trying to think of other performances that are this unhinged, I'm thinking of like Albert Ayler or Ornette Coleman or Peter Breutzmann records. Like hardcore free jazz. It's an insane royal of noise where the whole thing sounds like rock and roll, but any individual part sounds like total nonsense if you were to zoom in on it. He's clearly Hendrix influenced, but way more disordered. He's sort of Hendrixian, but also sort of makes Hendrix sound like Bach. While Hendrix's crazy storm clouds of noise flash with light and melody, for Falcone it's pretty much all crazy storm clouds all the time. He also doesn't play a single identifiable melodic figure on the entire record. And despite the tunes being built around very simple looping riffs and chord progressions, he never plays anything the same way twice. And he's also doing that noise rock thing where he kind of never takes a solo, but is also kind of soloing basically the entire record. So basically he sounds kind of like Hendrix, but also kind of like hundreds of thousands of bells being fed into a giant diesel-powered meat grinder. But if that makes the record sound dark and brooding and miserable, it's not. It certainly has a lot of extremely dark moments, but it is a fundamentally joyful album. I wrote about Flipper in a zine I wrote about doom metal a few years back. Yes, I know that's a stretch, but they were a big influence on Black Flag, who were a big influence on sludge metal, so I felt like I had to talk about them. Anyway, here's what I had to say about Ever and Way of the World. On the days when I don't think that Black Flag's Damaged is the finest rock and roll album of all time, I sometimes think that its album, Generic Flipper. It's ill-tempered and good-humored alike, and depressed and exuberant in equal measure. Their lazy tempos are buoyed by snappy hand claps and by DePace's splashy drumming and Falcone's ceaselessly discordant clangor, which is quite simply one of the greatest electric guitar performances of all time, holds such an irrepressibly ecstatic joy within its sloshing sea of cacophony that he sounds like the whole damn Ornette Coleman double quartet condensed into a single man, as he endlessly mutates the tune's simple chordal vamps, never quite beyond all recognition but often to its utmost ragged edge. And the lyrics are no less expansive, with the way of the world about nothing less, encapsulating the wistful oddness of impermanence even as it shrugs it all off in only a dozen declarative lines, and ever loosing a barrage of rhetorical questions that give form to 100 nameless private sicknesses that everyone suffers and no one really knows how to deal with. And again, shrugs it all off. Have you ever? I have. So what? And about Life is Cheap and Life. Flipper's darkest and brightest moments are both about approximately the same subject matter, because that's just the kind of band they are. They're philosophically advanced enough to know that existential despair and existential contentment are the same thing depending on how you squint at it, and also philosophically advanced enough to know that choosing happiness all the time just ain't right. And they're musically advanced enough to strike both sides of the coin, with Life is Cheap grinding away like metal on concrete over the blatant malice of its one-bar modal vamp, while Life applies the same arbitrarily noisy harmonic principles to the pure fucking joy of its belligerently exuberant chord vamp, made even more joyous by Falcone's endlessly raucous tintinnabulations. Also by its wrenching by a tritone from the flat 7 to a bracingly strident 3 chord on the third bar of every 4, because sometimes a sour note is just what you need hollered into your ear to make you feel really alive. Life may be cheap, but at least it's life. At least for a while. And about Nothing and Livin' for the Depression. The secret of Flipper's greatness is ultimately the same as that of the greatest jazz musicians, which is that how they play is a direct continuation of who they are and how they live. They're desperate and triumphant and noisy and poetic and bellicose and exuberant and touching and funny because life is desperate and funny, etc., etc. And the only dividing line between their music and the thrum and clatter of the whole damn world is that they can sometimes manage to make it rhyme and play it in time. When they can't manage that anymore, it collapses down to a single point of infinite wisdom. I'm not living life to be a real cheap fucker like you, cop out! But if there's one Flipper song you already know, it's probably the album closer, Sex Bomb. The defining noise rock song of all time, and pretty high up in the rock and roll pantheon generally, Sex Bomb is another one of those tunes that's so obviously great and so maddeningly insubstantial that it very nearly defies all analysis. I've banged on quite a bit about the mysteries of rock and roll in previous issues, so I'll spare you the general rhapsodizing and just tell you what the thing actually is. A long, hypnotic modal riot in A Mixolydian, with Will Shatter hollering a grand total of about 9 words over exactly 0 chord changes, while Bruce Luce's bass endlessly bumps out its goofy, unsyncopated ostinato over Steve DePace's clangingly bouncy beat in perfectly imperfect time, and under Ted Falcone's arbitrarily squawking tritones, alongside cartoonish glissandi from electronic slide whistles, plus a couple of saxophones, credited to 2 individuals named only as Bobby and Ward, that alternate between chiming in with the main riff and cutting loose with the energy jazz skronk. It's every bit as damn well stupid as it sounds, and 10,000 times better than I could ever put into words. Every day we're surrounded by superficial perfection, but we don't have to be. There are things more perfect than perfection if you know how to find them, and all it takes is a little looking and a little honesty with yourself about what's really important. And most important of all, you can do it too. Now get out there and make a mess.